James Morrison stood at attention outside Buckingham Palace, his red uniform perfectly pressed and his black bearskin hat sitting precisely on his head. Tourists walked by, taking photos and making jokes about the motionless guards. Some tried to make him laugh, pulling faces or telling silly jokes. Others wondered if the guards were even real people underneath those fancy uniforms. "Look at him, he's like a statue," laughed a teenage boy from America, waving his hand in front of James's face. "Do you think he's allowed to blink?" James had heard it all before. After 3 years as a Queen's Guard, he had become used to the comments, the stares, and the assumptions people made about him. Most visitors thought the guards were just for show, fancy decorations to make the palace look more impressive. They had no idea what kind of training and background was required to stand in that position. The truth was that James Morrison had served 8 years in the British Army before becoming a Royal Guard. He had been deployed to Afghanistan twice and had completed some of the most challenging military training programs available. But standing outside the palace in his ceremonial uniform, none of that was visible to the passing crowds. His fellow guards often joked about how civilians saw them. "They think we're toy soldiers," said his friend Marcus during their break. "If only they knew what we've been through to get here." James had grown up in a small town in northern England. His father worked in a factory, and his mother was a nurse. Money was always tight, but his parents had taught him the value of hard work and dedication. From a young age, James had been fascinated by the military. He would watch documentaries about special forces and read books about famous battles. When he turned 18, James enlisted in the army immediately after finishing school. His parents were worried but proud. They knew their son had always been different from other kids his age. While his friends were interested in video games and parties, James spent his free time learning about tactics and studying military history. Basic training was tough, but James excelled. He was physically strong and mentally sharp. His instructors noticed his natural abilities, especially his exceptional eyesight and steady hands. During shooting practice, James consistently scored higher than his peers. He could hit targets that others struggled to even see clearly. "Morrison, you've got a gift," Sergeant Williams told him after a particularly impressive shooting session. "Have you ever considered specialized training?" James had heard about the elite units, but he thought they were beyond his reach. Coming from a small town with no military connections, he assumed such opportunities were only for people with better backgrounds or connections. His first deployment to Afghanistan opened his eyes to the reality of modern warfare. James was assigned to a regular infantry unit, but he quickly proved himself in combat situations. His ability to spot enemy positions from long distances made him valuable to his team. During one particularly dangerous mission, James managed to identify and eliminate a sniper who had been targeting British forces for weeks. "That was an incredible shot," said Lieutenant Cooper, reviewing the mission report. "The target was over 800 meters away and you made it look easy." James had fired from a concealed position, using equipment that was far from ideal. The shot had saved several lives and allowed his unit to complete their mission safely. Word of his performance began to spread among the officers. Back in England, between deployments, James continued to train and improve his skills. He spent hours at the shooting range, working on accuracy and consistency. He studied wind patterns, learned about different types of ammunition, and practiced shooting from various positions and distances. His second deployment to Afghanistan was with a different unit, one that gave him more opportunities to use his specialized skills. James was often assigned to overwatch positions, where he could provide support for ground operations while remaining hidden from enemy forces. During one mission, James spent 3 days in a concealed position, watching an area where intelligence suggested enemy fighters were planning an attack on a British convoy. For hours at a time, he remained perfectly still, observing through his scope and waiting for any sign of movement. On the third day, James spotted a group of enemy fighters setting up an ambush position. They were well hidden and would have been nearly impossible to detect without his exceptional observation skills. James radioed the information to command and was given permission to engage. His shots were precise and effective, preventing what could have been a devastating attack on British forces. The convoy passed through the area safely, never knowing how close they had come to danger. "Morrison, your work out there was exceptional," said Major Harrison during the debriefing. "Have you ever thought about applying for Special Forces selection?" The suggestion surprised James. He had always admired the SAS and other elite units, but he had never seriously considered applying. The training was notoriously difficult, and the failure rate was extremely high. Most candidates came from elite military backgrounds or had years of specialized experience. "I'm not sure I'm qualified, sir," James replied honestly. "Qualification isn't just about background," the major explained. "It's about ability, dedication, and mental toughness. From what I've seen, you have all three." James decided to apply for SAS selection after completing his deployment. The process was intimidating from the start. Hundreds of soldiers applied, but only a small percentage would make it through the grueling training program. The initial physical and psychological tests eliminated many candidates immediately. James passed these early stages, but he knew the real challenges were still ahead. The selection process was designed to push soldiers beyond their limits and identify those with the exceptional qualities needed for special operations. During the mountain phase of training, candidates had to navigate difficult terrain while carrying heavy equipment and completing complex tasks under time pressure. Many experienced soldiers dropped out during this phase, unable to handle the physical and mental demands. James struggled at times, but his determination kept him going. He had grown up hiking in the hills of northern England, which gave him some advantage in rough terrain. More importantly, he had developed mental toughness through his previous military experience and personal challenges. The shooting phases of selection were where James truly excelled. His natural abilities, combined with years of practice and combat experience, made him stand out among the candidates. Instructors who had seen thousands of soldiers over the years took notice of his exceptional skills. "I've never seen accuracy like that from a candidate," one instructor commented privately to his colleagues. "He's hitting targets that most of our current operators would struggle with." James successfully completed SAS selection, joining one of the most elite military units in the world. The training that followed was even more intensive, covering everything from close combat to complex infiltration techniques. James learned skills that most soldiers never even hear about, preparing him for operations that required the highest levels of precision and secrecy. However, after several years with the SAS, James made a decision that surprised many of his colleagues. He chose to leave Special Forces and apply for a position as a Queen's Guard. His friends in the SAS thought he was making a mistake, giving up an exciting and prestigious career for what they saw as a ceremonial role. "Why would you want to stand around outside a palace all day?" asked his former teammate Sarah. "You're wasting your talents." James had his reasons. He wanted a more stable lifestyle and the opportunity to serve his country in a different way. He was also drawn to the history and tradition associated with guarding the royal family. The role was more complex than most people realized, requiring extensive background checks and ongoing security training. Now, standing outside Buckingham Palace, James looked like any other ceremonial guard to the passing tourists. They saw the red uniform and tall hat, but they had no idea about the man underneath. They didn't know about his years of military service, his combat experience, or his specialized training with one of the world's most elite units. A group of teenagers approached, giggling and pointing their phones at him. One of them made a joke about how the guards probably couldn't even tie their own shoes without help. James remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged. while internally he remembered missions where his skills had saved lives and prevented disasters. The irony wasn't lost on him. People assumed that because he stood motionless in a ceremonial uniform, he must be weak or incapable. They had no idea that the man they were laughing at had capabilities that few people in the world possessed. As the day continued, James maintained his position with the same discipline and focus he had used during the most dangerous missions of his military career. The tourists continued to pass by, making their assumptions and taking their photos, completely unaware of the extraordinary background of the man they were dismissing as just another decorative soldier. The morning started like any other for James Morrison. He arrived at the palace before dawn, went through the standard security checks, and prepared for another day of ceremonial duty. The weather was overcast, and a light rain had left the streets wet and slippery. James put on his red uniform with the same care and precision he had shown every day for the past 2 years. What James didn't know was that intelligence services had been tracking a serious security threat for several weeks. A group of highly trained individuals had been planning an attack on a high-profile target in London. The details were still unclear, but intercepted communications suggested the threat was imminent and sophisticated. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins from the Metropolitan Police Counter-Terrorism Unit had been coordinating with various security agencies to address the threat. The group they were tracking had connections to international criminal organizations and had access to advanced weapons and equipment. "We're dealing with professionals," Inspector Collins explained to her team during their morning briefing. "These aren't random terrorists or criminals. They have military training and significant resources. We need to be prepared for anything." The intelligence suggested that the attack might target a location in central London, but the exact details remained unclear. Security had been increased at all major landmarks, government buildings, and royal residences. However, the threat was so sophisticated that traditional security measures might not be sufficient. James began his shift outside Buckingham Palace at 8 in the morning, taking his position alongside 3 other guards. Tourists were already gathering, despite the early hour and poor weather. The palace was always busy, but security personnel had noticed some unusual activity in the area over the past few days. Among the tourists that morning was a man named Victor Petrov, though that wasn't his real name. He had been observing the palace security for 2 weeks, noting patterns and identifying potential weaknesses. Victor was a former military officer from Eastern Europe who now worked for criminal organizations willing to pay for his specialized skills. Victor's mission was to assess the palace defenses and identify the best approach for a planned operation. His employers wanted to demonstrate their capabilities by executing a high-profile attack that would embarrass British security services and send a message to their rivals. As Victor watched the guards from a distance, he felt confident about the operation. The ceremonial guards appeared to be exactly what they seemed: decorative soldiers with no real combat capabilities. His team had advanced weapons and military experience, while the guards appeared to have nothing but colorful uniforms and traditional ceremonies. "The target is surrounded by toy soldiers," Victor reported to his associates through an encrypted communication device. "This will be easier than we anticipated." What Victor didn't know was that British intelligence services had identified him and several of his associates. They had been under surveillance for days, but authorities wanted to gather more information about their plans before making arrests. The situation was delicate because premature action could allow other members of the group to escape or trigger backup plans. Inspector Collins was coordinating the response from a command center near the palace. She had teams positioned around the area, ready to respond if the situation escalated. However, she was concerned about the capabilities of the threat they were facing. "These individuals have military training and sophisticated equipment," she explained to the palace security coordinator. "If they decide to move against the palace, our response will need to be immediate and precise." The palace security coordinator assured her that additional measures were in place, including armed police positioned discreetly around the perimeter. However, both officials were concerned about the possibility of a complex, multi-stage attack that could overwhelm traditional security responses. At 10:30 in the morning, Victor made his move. He approached the palace gates with 3 associates, all carrying concealed weapons and equipment. Their plan was to create a distraction that would allow them to breach the perimeter and demonstrate their capabilities before disappearing into the crowded London streets. James noticed the 4 men approaching before his colleagues did. Something about their movement and positioning immediately triggered his trained instincts. During his time with the SAS, James had learned to identify potential threats through subtle behavioral cues that most people would miss. The men were walking in a formation that suggested military training. Their eyes were scanning the area in a systematic way, and they were communicating with each other through small gestures. Most concerning to James was that they were approaching from different directions, but timing their movement to converge on the same location. James couldn't break his ceremonial position or communicate directly with security personnel without potentially causing panic among the tourists. However, his training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. He began using subtle signals that would be recognized by other security personnel in the area. Victor and his associates reached their planned positions around 10:45. They had small explosive devices concealed in their clothing, along with automatic weapons that could be assembled quickly from components hidden in their bags. The plan was to create chaos, demonstrate their capabilities, and escape before authorities could respond effectively. At 11 o'clock, Victor gave the signal for his team to begin their operation. They started moving toward the palace gates while reaching for their concealed weapons. What they didn't expect was that their every move had been anticipated by someone who appeared to be just a ceremonial guard. James had been tracking all 4 men since they first approached the area. His exceptional eyesight and training allowed him to identify the exact moment when they transitioned from surveillance to action. In that instant, James made a decision that would change everything. Without breaking his ceremonial stance or alerting the tourists around him, James activated a small communication device concealed in his uniform. This sent an immediate alert to palace security and counterterrorism units positioned in the area. 4 targets moving to execute, James whispered into the concealed microphone. Armed and coordinated, southwest approach near the main gates. Inspector Collins received the alert in her command center and immediately dispatched response teams. However, she realized that by the time armed police reached the scene, the attackers might have already initiated their plan. The situation required immediate action from someone already in position. Victor had just reached into his bag to retrieve the components of his weapon when he noticed that one of the ceremonial guards was looking directly at him. For a moment, their eyes met, and Victor realized that this guard was different from what he had expected. James could see that Victor was reaching for a weapon and knew that he had only seconds to act before civilians were put in danger. The tourists around the palace had no idea what was happening, continuing to take photos and chat among themselves. Drawing on his years of SAS training, James began to move with a speed and precision that shocked everyone watching. In one fluid motion, he stepped out of his ceremonial position and disarmed the nearest attacker while simultaneously alerting other guards to the threat. The transformation was stunning to witness. One moment, James appeared to be a motionless, ceremonial figure. The next, he was moving with the skill and confidence of an elite special forces operator. His red uniform and tall hat suddenly seemed like camouflage rather than costume. Victor tried to complete the assembly of his weapon, but James was already moving toward him. Years of training in close combat and weapons handling made James incredibly dangerous in this type of situation. He could assess multiple threats simultaneously while taking precise action to neutralize each one. The first attacker went down before he could even understand what was happening. James disarmed him and rendered him unconscious in less than 3 seconds, using techniques that were taught only to the most elite military units. The tourists nearby initially thought it was some kind of performance or demonstration. Victor managed to partially assemble his weapon before James reached him. However, his military training, while extensive, was no match for someone who had completed SAS selection and years of specialized operations. James approached Victor with a combination of speed and caution that demonstrated his exceptional tactical awareness. "Put it down," James commanded, his voice carrying an authority that Victor immediately recognized as genuine military experience. Victor realized that he had seriously misjudged the situation. This was not a ceremonial guard with no real training. This was a highly skilled operator who could end the confrontation in seconds. Victor's hand hesitated on his weapon as he tried to assess his options. The other 2 attackers were also struggling to adapt to the unexpected resistance. They had planned for traditional security responses, not for immediate action from someone with elite special forces training. Their coordination began to break down as they realized their intelligence about the palace defenses had been completely wrong. Inspector Collins and her teams were rushing toward the scene, but the situation was already being resolved by someone they hadn't even known was there. The man in the red uniform was handling a sophisticated terrorist attack with a level of skill that impressed even experienced counter-terrorism professionals. James moved with calculated precision, disabling threats while protecting civilians and maintaining control of the situation. His movements demonstrated years of training in environments where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. The tourists finally began to realize that something serious was happening. Some started to move away from the area, while others pulled out their phones to record what they thought might be some kind of special security exercise. None of them understood that they were witnessing the neutralization of a genuine terrorist threat by someone they had been laughing at just minutes earlier. Victor made a final attempt to escape, but James anticipated his movement and intercepted him before he could reach the crowd. The takedown was swift and professional, leaving Victor subdued and disarmed without any risk to nearby civilians. By the time Inspector Collins and her teams arrived at the palace, all 4 attackers had been neutralized by a single guard who looked like he had stepped out of a tourist postcard. The contrast between his ceremonial appearance and his devastating effectiveness created a surreal scene that would be remembered by everyone present. Inspector Collins arrived at the scene expecting to coordinate a complex counterterrorism response, but instead found 4 unconscious attackers secured with improvised restraints and a guard in a red uniform standing calmly beside them. The contrast was so striking that she initially thought she had arrived at the wrong location. "Are you the officer who called in the alert?" she asked James, still trying to process what she was seeing. "Guard Morrison, ma'am," James replied, returning to his formal demeanor. "I observed suspicious behavior and took appropriate action to secure the area." The tourists who had witnessed the confrontation were buzzing with excitement and confusion. Most of them had never seen anything like it. One moment they were taking photos of what they thought were decorative soldiers, and the next they had watched one of those soldiers neutralize a sophisticated attack with skills that seemed to come from an action movie. "Did you see that?" exclaimed Maria Santos, a tourist from Spain who had been filming the guards just minutes before the incident. "That guard moved like he was in the military or something special." Her husband Carlos was reviewing the video he had captured on his phone. "This is incredible. He went from standing perfectly still to disarming those men faster than I could follow. These guards are not what we thought they were." Detective Inspector Collins was examining the weapons and equipment the attackers had been carrying. The sophistication of their gear confirmed that this had been a serious threat. The explosive devices alone could have caused significant damage and casualties if the attack had proceeded as planned. "Where did you receive your training?" Inspector Collins asked James privately while her team processed the crime scene. "I served with the SAS before joining the Guard, ma'am," James replied, matter-of-factly. The inspector stared at him for a moment, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. She had been wondering how a ceremonial guard had managed to identify and neutralize a threat that had evaded detection by multiple intelligence services for weeks. "The SAS," she repeated, understanding now why the response had been so effective. "That explains quite a lot." News of the incident spread quickly through social media and traditional news outlets. The tourists who had witnessed the confrontation shared their videos and photos, creating a viral sensation that captured international attention. The image of a guard in a red uniform standing over defeated attackers became symbolic of hidden strength and unexpected heroism. The story took on a life of its own as people learned more about James Morrison's background. News organizations discovered his military service record, his deployment to Afghanistan, and his years with the SAS before joining the Queen's Guard. The revelation transformed public perception of the Royal Guards completely. "I always thought those guards were just for show," admitted Peter Thompson, a London resident who had seen them hundreds of times. "I never imagined they might be former Special Forces soldiers. It makes you see them completely differently." The Metropolitan Police released a statement praising the quick thinking and professional response that had prevented what could have been a devastating attack. However, they were careful not to reveal too many details about James's background or the specific nature of the threat. Viktor Petrov and his associates found themselves facing serious terrorism charges. During interrogation, Viktor admitted that he had completely underestimated the capabilities of British security, particularly the guards he had dismissed as ceremonial decorations. "We thought they were just for tourists," Viktor told investigators. "The intelligence we received said they were not real soldiers. We were very wrong about that." The investigation revealed that the attack had been planned as a demonstration of capability by an international criminal organization. The goal was to embarrass British security and prove that even the most protected locations could be infiltrated. Instead, the operation had resulted in the immediate capture of their operatives and the exposure of their methods. James found himself thrust into an unwanted spotlight. News reporters wanted interviews, and television producers offered him opportunities to tell his story. However, true to his military training and personal character, James declined most requests for public appearances. "I was just doing my job," he told the few reporters he did speak with. "Every guard takes their responsibility seriously, regardless of their background. We're not here for decoration." The revelation about James's background led to increased interest in the selection and training of royal guards. Many people had assumed that the positions were purely ceremonial, filled by soldiers with limited combat experience. The reality was far more complex and impressive. Colonel Richardson, who oversaw the Queen's Guard program, explained to media that while not all guards had SAS backgrounds, every member underwent extensive vetting and training. "We don't discuss the specific backgrounds of our personnel for security reasons," he said, "but I can assure you that every guard is a highly trained professional." The incident also led to changes in how potential threats assessed British security capabilities. Intelligence services noted a significant shift in communications among criminal and terrorist organizations who now realized that their assumptions about soft targets might be dangerously incorrect. James returned to his regular duties within a week of the incident, but the atmosphere around him had changed completely. Tourists now looked at the guards with new respect and understanding. Some visitors specifically asked to take photos with the hero guard, though James maintained his professional demeanor and ceremonial protocols. His fellow guards treated him with the same respect they always had, though they enjoyed the newfound appreciation from the public. "Finally, people understand that we're not just here to look pretty," joked Marcus during their break. "Though I have to say, James, you could have warned us you were SAS." James smiled but remained modest about his background and actions. "Every one of us has skills and experience," he replied. "I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." The long-term impact of the incident extended beyond just public perception. Security services began reviewing their assumptions about various protective details and ceremonial units. The realization that highly trained personnel might be serving in unexpected roles led to more comprehensive threat assessments. Inspector Collins included James's actions in her final report on the incident, noting that the quick resolution had likely saved multiple lives and prevented significant property damage. The professional response demonstrated that effective security often comes from unexpected sources, she wrote. Several months after the incident, James received a commendation from senior palace officials and recognition from his former SAS unit. However, the attention he valued most came from a letter written by a young girl who had been visiting the palace with her school class on the day of the attack. "Dear Guard Morrison," the letter read, "thank you for keeping us safe. I want to be brave like you when I grow up. Now when people say something is just for show, I will remember that sometimes the most important things are hidden where you can't see them." James kept that letter in his locker, finding it more meaningful than any official recognition or media coverage. It reminded him why he had chosen to serve, both in the military and in his current role protecting the traditions and people of his country. The incident became a case study in security training programs around the world, demonstrating how preparation, observation skills, and quick thinking could prevent catastrophic events. James's transformation from seemingly decorative guard to effective counter-terrorism operative became an example of how appearances could be deceiving and how proper training could make all the difference. Years later, James still serves as a Queen's Guard, continuing his duties with the same dedication and professionalism he had always shown. Tourists still take photos and make comments, but now there's often a note of respect and curiosity in their voices. "I wonder what his story is," people say as they pass by. Understanding now that the men in red uniforms might have extraordinary backgrounds and capabilities hidden beneath their ceremonial appearance. James never sought fame or recognition for his actions that day. He had simply done what his training and instincts told him was necessary to protect innocent people and serve his country. The fact that he had surprised everyone, including himself, was less important to him than the knowledge that he had lived up to the standards set by his military service and personal values. The Royal Guards continue their duties as they always have, standing watch over Britain's most important institutions and traditions. But now everyone knows that beneath those red uniforms and tall black hats are individuals with remarkable skills and dedication, ready to transform from ceremonial figures to effective protectors at a moment's notice. The lesson learned that day at Buckingham Palace was simple but powerful. Never judge people by their appearance or assume that what you see on the surface tells the complete story. Sometimes the most capable and dangerous people are hiding in plain sight, disguised as something entirely different from what they really are. James Morrison had spent years being underestimated and dismissed by people who saw only his uniform and not the man wearing it. In one dramatic morning, he reminded everyone that true strength and capability often come from unexpected sources, and that the best protection sometimes comes from those you least suspect of having the skills to provide it.